Hiya YouTubers, this is Superman G, come back at you one more again. In this video I want to talk to you about chipsets. Now chipsets are what they sound like. They are a set of chips that are soldered onto the motherboard, usually placed on the bottom right with a cover over them. Sometimes they'll have LEDs that light up when someone turns a computer on, and when you see that little LED light up down at the bottom right, that's usually the chipset. And they usually have a cover on them. It's like a heat seat to protect them, and to actually try to keep them cool. Now, chipsets determine things like how much maximum memory the motherboard can take, even what type of processors the motherboard can accept, and other various instructions. Now, to a beginner, this may seem like it has nothing to do with your knowing of this, when in fact, it actually does. Let's say, for example, you're looking for a processor and you come across this Intel Core i5. Now, you will notice the title words Intel 400 series chipset. Now, this is important because it helps you in determining that a motherboard with the 400 series chipset will work with this processor. You also want to pay attention to the socket type, which is the LGA 1200, because this will help you in determining which motherboard to get that will accept this type of processor. So with that, you want to look for a motherboard that has the LGA 1200 and the type of chipset that the motherboard will accept. So now you want to head over to wherever you look for your motherboards, whether it's Amazon or Newegg or wherever else you purchase your computer parts from, looking for that 400 series motherboard. So in this example, I'm going to head over to ASUS's website. And to get to this, you want to go to asus.com. And you're going to go over to motherboards, and you're going to select Intel, and then you can select whichever motherboard you're looking for whatever reason you're looking for. And then in this case, as an example, I selected Asus Prime. And this is the motherboard that I looked for. And as you can see, this Asus Prime motherboard has the title Intel Z490 LGA 1200. Now, we know that this motherboard will work with the processor we looked at earlier because it has LGA 1200. And if you go back, you see this is LGA 1200 on the processor. So we know that works. So how do you know that processor works with this motherboard? Well, we have the LGA 1200, but we also know that this is a 400 series chip motherboard. Well, once again, how do we know that? Well, it's in the title here. Okay? And the way you determine that is ignore the letter Z and then focus on the 490. Okay? The 4 determines that this is actually a key, and it means the chipset on this motherboard is a 400 series. Note that this number can be a higher number, and it will work with the same processor in this example because the socket type is the same. Okay, we'll talk about that later. Now look at the LGA next to it. This is the socket type at which the processor will fit into. If we go back to the Intel processor we looked at earlier, you can see that its socket LGA 1200 matches up with the same on the motherboard title, LGA 1200. And it also matches up with the 4, which means it's a 400 series chipset, with the 400 that is on the processor page. So we know that this processor will work with this motherboard because they are of the same. Now, also note that as long as you keep the numbers the same, then the 400 chipset with the 4 on the motherboard, they match up and they will work. Now, also note that the model number on the motherboard could be a higher number, let's say 5. But as long as the socket type LGA1200 on that motherboard is the same as the processor socket type LGA1200, then they can work together. And make certain that the motherboard can accept the generation. So here's an example. So here's a motherboard that has a Intel socket LGA1200, but it may say that this is a Z530 motherboard. Well, the 5 may throw you off because you're thinking that, well, this motherboard can only accept an Intel 400 series chipset. That may be true, but the socket is what you want to pay attention to. LGA1200. So with this socket here is saying LGA1200. So as long as the socket on the motherboard matches up with the socket of the processor, that processor will go on to this motherboard. And another thing to pay attention to, make certain that the motherboard can accept the generation of the processor. So if the motherboard will only accept 11th generation and 10th generation processors, then this processor will work because it is a 10th generation processor. And I have a video about how to determine a processor's generation. I'm going to put that card up in this area so you can learn how to know the generation of a processor. If it's a processor under what the motherboard is asking for, say like if it's a 9th generation or an 8th generation, it will not work. So when you're searching for the processors and the motherboard to go with them, take your time in making your selections. And if you do get confused, ask someone for help or shoot me a message either here or on Discord, where you can find me under my same name, Superman G, and I'll do what I can to try to help you out and answer your question. I hope this helps you guys out. You all take care, be safe, and peace out.